Well, it's a delight and an honor to speak after these two people. I'll be trying to respond to some of the points that they gave, and so you'll see that my slides are kind of, I'll be repeating some points, but hopefully with a little bit of a twist. And that twist is that for the past 5 years or so, Itai Shlagi, myself, and a bunch of students at Stanford have been working pretty closely with the San Francisco School District to redesign their student assignment policy. And this was prompted by a board resolution in 2018 to redesign student assignment. They were already using school choice, but they wanted to redesign it to improve diversity, predictability, proximity, all lens of equity of access. And so if you want to read about the initial stuff we did there to inform their selection of a new policy in 2020, that's in this EC paper that we published in 2022. Okay, but kind of prompted by my experiences there, I want to start by asking, like, what are we trying to solve for when we design these student assignment settings? And in San Francisco, what we saw is that there are potentially other objectives in student assignment beyond just giving parents the schools that they choose, right? So Derek kind of alluded to this, but perhaps one reason we might like choice is that we think it's a way to identify good schools. And what Parag was kind of pointing to is maybe our goal is to assign kids to these good schools, to the ones where they'll be able to learn the most. Another objective that was very important in the San Francisco redesign was this equity idea. And so there's a lot of research in the economics of education literature and just the education literature in general, to sort of documenting growing gaps in academic achievement between white students and Black students at the level of, two to 5 grade levels of difference between white Black students across different states. Also research showing that often a lot of these gaps are correlated with things about who is being assigned to which schools, right? And so there's recent research from the Stanford Educational Opportunity Project that shows that if we have our racial minority students concentrated in high poverty schools, this is really correlated with the highest racial academic achievement gaps. And so there's this idea, okay, maybe we want to improve learning equitably. And for that reason, we might also care about diversity. Okay. And so if we take these as some of our potential objectives, we look at how choice maps onto this. One thing we find is that choice might not always be a very good proxy for these other goals. Right? And so Parag has a bunch of work showing that choice might not really accurately reflect school quality, effectiveness, or value add. There's also work showing that choice might not capture other distributional district level goals, such as diversity. And so if you're interested in kind of hearing about like the on the ground social kind of dynamics of what's going on, a really interesting podcast is the Nice White Parents podcast. One of the points they made in this was this idea of a bliss point. There's often parents will talk about good schools and they ask, well, how are parents defining a good school? What makes a school that a parent is comfortable with? And so there's this paper that asks, well, how many white kids are needed at school to make other white families feel comfortable choosing that school? And I fortuitously, completely by accident, covered the answer. 26%. Okay. Okay. So choice might not capture other distributional goals, such as diversity. And this was something that we saw in the data that we had from San Francisco as well. Okay. So what I'm showing you here is a couple of maps. On the left, I'm showing a redlining map from the 30s. So for those of you who don't know, redlining was a practice that was very common across the US that systematically denied families that lived in these certain red blocks in this map access to a lot of different financial resources such as mortgages and other loans. Okay, and so what this does is if you're denying access to wealth for a whole bunch of families, well, they're gonna be poor in that generation and that those effects are going to compound over time, right? And so what I'm showing you on the right is again, San Francisco now in 2018, and I have two things here. In the background, I have a heat map. This is the percentage of students living in each attendance area, those blocky things, those are areas around schools, who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Okay, so this is data that's collected by the school district. It's very commonly used in educational research as a measure of socioeconomic need. Okay, so you can see the darker areas in the heat map in the back pretty much correspond with the red line blocks in the 30s. Okay, on top of that, I've superimposed these circles. The circles are the schools, the elementary schools, and the red circles are the 50% of schools which have the highest percentage of students attending the school who are eligible for free reduced price lunch. Okay, and so this is in 2018, and so San Francisco has been using a district-wide choice system since 2011, and one of the goals or desired outcomes of using choice was to disentangle residential and school segregation. The idea is maybe even though our neighborhoods are pretty segregated socioeconomically, as we can see in the heat map, if we let you go to schools that are anywhere across the district, the schools don't have to be segregated in the same ways. Okay, and what we see is 7 years after switching to the choice system, that we basically have the same segregation patterns in the schools compared to the neighborhoods. The interesting thing is when we look closer at the data, it's not that everyone is just going to school close to home. There's something in the preferences where people are actually going further to school, but they're self-segregating again into patterns that look a lot like the patterns of the neighborhoods. Okay, so I guess one call here is to kind of think about, well, how can we design these marketplaces when we do have these other goals, when we have distributional goals like diversity. And so I forgot to include a slide on this, but there's I think a lot of work just kind of assumes we can use reserves, we can use priorities, but the question of how do we precisely design those reserves and priorities to achieve these goals is one I think that's a little bit understudied and could be really interesting. Okay. So now let me respond a little bit to some of the points made by Parag and Derek. So first, Parag raised this idea of resource augmentation, and I'm going to take that and rephrase the question a little bit. Are there policies that move beyond market clearing, just kind of shuffling things around to allow for some kind of Pareto improvement? Okay, and I'm going to give a couple of examples motivated by what we've been seeing in the San Francisco School District. If we actually match those up to what Parag's paper is saying, some of these may have much smaller impacts than just closing failing schools. But I think there's still interesting questions worth studying, in part because some of these may be more politically feasible than closing schools. I think closing schools is a very contentious topic in a lot of districts. Okay. So one thing that came up for us when we were talking about San Francisco is perhaps we could shift resources around. Okay, so there's this assumption when the district moved to full choice that if we let anyone apply to any school, that means they can access any school. Right, San Francisco is a pretty big district. Okay, it's a lot of miles across. I think it's like 7 miles in diameter, and it takes you over half an hour to get from one side to the other side, and even more in rush hour traffic. Okay, and so you don't really have effective access to schools that are all the way across the district unless you really, really, really want to go there. Okay, and so what I'm showing you here, the red things are the San Francisco all the elementary schools in the district. And the bluish ones are the ones that have Spanish immersion programs. These are very popular language programs in the district. You can see those programs are really concentrated in one area of the district. And so there is this sort of suggestion early on, it didn't pan out because of political issues, but there's a suggestion, maybe we can take these programs that parents value and maybe we can kind of move them around a bit, spread them more equitably across the district so that everyone has something that they like that's a little bit closer to them, right? And you don't have to go across the district in order to be able to go to a Spanish immersion program. Okay, so this sort of joint problem, how do we move around resources and look at what we expect the choice outcomes to be after moving around those resources. And we can also layer in all these other things we mentioned before about designing priorities or reserves for other distributional outcomes like diversity. How can we sort of jointly make all of these decisions? Okay. Another obvious resource augmentation, what resource can we add? We can add schools. And so that's also something that came up in San Francisco as sort of a big topic of discussion in the past few years has been this new mission-based school that is being built. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that this idea of, well, what are the effects of moving around existing resources or adding resources is something that came up a lot, even just in the policy discussion that was going on in San Francisco. Okay. But what can we do from a research perspective? I think there's a lot of questions here that people have already started looking into. So for example, in terms of adding resources, on top of opening schools, we could also just add seats at schools or move teachers around to create more capacity at schools. And this is something that has been looked at by a couple of groups of people. In addition, I think there's also some room to shift preferences without necessarily changing the schools themselves, right? And so we can think of peer effects, right? There's basically a lot of Parag's work is showing that parents aren't really looking at school effectiveness. They're looking at their peers and which peers they want their kids to go to schools with. And that accounts for a lot of the choice patterns. And so perhaps it's possible if we do some kind of, community cohesion approach, or we take some more general approach to incorporating peer effects, we can Pareto improve without, we can Pareto improve if we're able to include that in our modeling. And then everyone's already mentioned a lot of these papers on information provision and nudging. Okay. In addition, I think shifting preferences can be thought of as some kind of resource augmentation for the following reason, that they can actually incentivize more resources to come in to the district. Okay? Specifically, I'm talking about the fact that school choice is not a closed system, right? So when we have our public schools, as was alluded to before, we have this, we also have charter schools, and maybe we can try to unify these using unified enrollment. But we also have private schools, right? And more we're seeing that a lot of families, or well-off families, are opting out of the public school system altogether and just going to private school. And that does affect the resources that are available to the districts, because there's a lot of reasons, but a few of them are that resources available from state and federal sources are often based on enrollment, how many people are enrolled at the school. And then also a lot of resources are also at schools are generated by PTA, parent-teacher associations, right? And so if a lot of the wealthy parents are opting out of the system altogether, then a lot of that funding is just not available at the schools. And so if we can sort of improve preferences, I know I started out by saying maybe we are indexing too much on choice, but the reason we might still care about choice if we're thinking about resource augmentation is that this could incentivize families to stay. It could also incentivize teachers to stay. We could think about, the assignment problem of how do we assign teachers to schools. And there's a little bit of work on this by Juliana and co-authors. But that could also address a problem that there's a growing teacher shortage. It's been growing since the 2010s. And about 50% of teachers who were surveyed in a 2022 national survey said that they had seriously considered leaving the profession. And so there's just this endemic teacher shortage. And so can we sort of design various systems that incentivize agents to stay in the school system? Building off this idea that school choice is not a closed system, there's a lot of other interesting directions. I'm just going to quickly name them and then move on from here. And so what other systems interact with school choice? Schools and housing. And so we might ask, well, if we change the student assignment, what does that mean for where people live? And then what does that mean for the property taxes and the funding for the schools? And then how does that mean for a student assignment? And so Aram, who is think somewhere in, yes, has a paper on this, and some of my co-authors, collaborators at Stanford also looked at the effects of certain geographically indexed policies on residential sorting. So one of my collaborators is expert in gentrification. And so he found this really interesting thing where there are these policies that give top priority to students who live in certain areas. These areas were those which had historically low test scores. The idea is you're historically educationally disadvantaged, we're going to give you priority. And so he found that all of these areas that were given priority, the sort of ones that had the most expensive housing went through dramatic gentrification because everyone is moving into that small number of blocks to try to get this special priority. Okay, so what other systems are interacting with school choice? What are the incentives that this induces in those systems, and then how does that affect the priorities that we've been designing in choice? Given that we have outside systems and these systems often don't talk to each other, for example, in our case, we have no idea what's going on with private school enrollment, and also students who just go to private school and never participate in public school enrollment, public school assignment. And so there's also this question of how do we manage this incomplete information about these outside systems, and I have a little bit of work on that. Okay. Now to respond briefly to Derek. I think one of his questions is, one of the points that he made was that we're trying to use information to kind of do two things at once, right? We're trying to use information to give parents information that they can use to make informed choices when going to school. But then we're also trying to collect information to try to kind of audit how well schools are doing. And I think that's a helpful kind of separation for me to think about, okay, there are these like different kinds of information that we might want to collect and these different kinds of information we might want to provide. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just thinking about that first kind. How much information do we need to give to parents for them to make an informed choice? And as has been said before, a lot of parents don't have full information. There's a lot of suggestive evidence. We see this in San Francisco as well. What I'm showing you here are histograms of the number of programs that applicants to kindergarten listed. So this is out of like 150 programs, right? People are listing a median of around 5 programs. Okay, and we see differences by race and socioeconomic status, and I'm showing it to you here just by race. You can see that my Black and African American families are listing way fewer schools than white families. Okay, and so what are the effects of this unequal access? Well, first, why are they even listing these short preference lists? We got some anecdotal reasons from parents and also the district staff. Some of this is they're actually forming accurate beliefs about their likelihood of getting into schools and not listing more schools than they need. But sometimes they also form inaccurate beliefs and then they list fewer schools. But then also sometimes it's just costly to figure out which schools that you're interested in. And so parents misunderstand the system or think that they don't need to put more schools, kind of like in Adam's Chile paper, and then they just stop listing schools. And the effect is that if you're not listing schools, then you're more likely to be unassigned or assigned to a school that you didn't list. And so a lot of this nudging paper has basically taken this first approach to sort of addressing this problem of costly information acquisition. Let's increase information provided to lesser informed groups through nudges or recommendation systems. And I think this is a really interesting, really exciting area. In fact, we took the approach by Adam et al. In the Chile paper, and we tried applying it to the San Francisco School District. And we asked, what if we kind of lengthen the lists of some of these students who are submitting short lists. And we also did some choice modeling to try to predict how they would sort of augment their lists. Okay. What we found is that in our case, this augmentation was actually leading to congestion. Okay, people were mostly applying to schools that were already full, or adding schools that were already full, and as a result, they were not seeing a big impact, and if they were kicking out other students. Right, so the effects were kind of mixed. It was not clear that that was the right approach in our setting. And so I think another approach that I don't really know how to think about, but which is really interesting, is thinking about decreasing the amount of information that is needed in order to interact well with the system. right? And so I think going back to what Derek was saying, well, maybe what people need to know is like their admission chances, right? Or Derek had 3 things, but that's the one I remember because that's also a point that I make in one of my papers. This is, so I have this paper with Nicole Morlika, Jacob Leschno, and Brendan Lucier, trying to model what happens in matching markets with costly information acquisition. And one of the points that we make is, well, maybe what you need to know is your chance of getting into a school. And so here's like a really nice picture from Israeli admissions in 2020. We looked at admissions, university admissions in lots of different countries all across the world. This one was really interesting because what they do is they have these 2 cutoffs, okay? You have your national score, exam score, and then if your exam score is above the cutoff, you can definitely get into this program. Okay, if your score is below the cutoff, so it's the red part, you definitely cannot get into this program. And then there's this gray area where they're actually saying we're not sure, but they're updating it as preferences and admission applications are coming in. And so that seems like a really interesting approach. And there's this general question of like, what is sort of the sufficient information that people need to know? Okay, so that's all I had to say. Thank you for listening.